The first time I saw those survey stakes in my backyard, I thought someone had made a mistake. The second time I saw them, I realized someone was trying to take something that belonged to my family, and by the time I found out who was behind it, I was already being told to sign away a piece of land that had been in my family longer than their entire neighborhood association had existed. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 52 years old, and I spent most of my adult life studying land boundaries, property records, and the strange little details that decide who owns what. I never imagined that one day I would have to use that same knowledge to defend my own home. The funny thing about land disputes is that everyone thinks they understand them until a piece of paper proves they do not. My house sits on a quiet street outside Cedar Hollow, Oregon, a place where people wave at each other, borrow tools, and pretend every disagreement can be solved with a polite conversation. My grandfather bought the property in 1960, long before Cedar Hollow Estates was built, long before the neighborhood association called Willow Creek Community Board existed, and long before anyone had the idea that a group of elected volunteers could decide what happened on land they did not own. The house was not fancy. It had old wooden floors, a small porch, and a side yard that most people would probably overlook. But to my family, that strip of land was never just dirt. My grandfather planted apple trees there. My father built a small workshop along the fence line. I spent summers there as a kid, fixing bicycles, digging holes for plants, and listening to stories about how my grandfather worked 2 jobs to afford that property. It was the kind of place that carried memories in every corner. So when I received a letter from the Willow Creek Community Board saying my side yard had been reclassified as shared community property, I honestly thought it was some kind of administrative error. The letter came from the new board president, Melissa Carter, a woman who had only lived in the neighborhood for a few years but quickly became known as someone who liked things organized, controlled, and exactly the way she wanted them. Melissa had a vision for the neighborhood. She wanted a walking path that connected 2 sections of the community, and my side yard happened to be the most convenient route. According to her, the original boundary lines were incorrect, and the land should have always been considered part of the common area. The letter gave me 14 days to sign a property release form. 14 days. That was it. No conversation. No request to review documents together. Just a deadline telling me to surrender land that my family had owned for more than 60 years. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading that letter over and over again, wondering if I was missing something. I was not angry at first. I was confused, because when you grow up believing something is true your entire life, it is strange when someone suddenly walks in and tells you that reality has changed because they drew a new line on a map. A few days later, I walked outside and saw bright orange survey markers along the edge of my yard. They had already marked what they called the corrected boundary. They had already planned the project. A contractor sign was sitting nearby, and I later learned they expected construction to begin within a month. That was the moment something changed inside me. It was no longer about a disagreement between neighbors. It was about the assumption that they could move faster than anyone could challenge them. Melissa believed I would do what most people do when faced with an official-looking letter. She believed I would feel intimidated, sign the paperwork, and move on. What she did not know was that I was a land surveyor. She did not know I had spent decades looking at property records and finding the truth hidden inside old documents that most people never bothered to read. So instead of arguing with her, instead of standing in my yard yelling at workers, I did the one thing I knew mattered more than opinions. I went looking for the original records. I drove to the county recorder office early on a Monday morning, carrying a notebook and the same feeling you get when you know you are about to discover something important. I asked for every document connected to my grandfather's purchase, the original deed, the old survey maps, every boundary record they had. I was not looking for a fight. I was looking for the truth, and what I found inside those old files would completely change the battle. Because hidden in a dusty county archive was a piece of evidence that the Willow Creek Board had clearly never seen, and if they had seen it, they probably would have never sent me that letter in the first place. When I opened the old survey records at the county office, I expected to find something complicated. Maybe a mistake from decades ago. Maybe a confusing boundary description. Maybe some kind of legal gray area that explained why Melissa Carter and the Willow Creek Board thought they had a claim. But what I found was much simpler than that. And honestly, that made it worse. The truth was sitting there in black and white. My grandfather's original deed from 1960 clearly described the property lines. and the original survey completed the following year showed something the HOA's updated map completely ignored. The side yard they were trying to take was not part of their community property at all. It was listed separately as Parcel C, a distinct piece of land with its own legal description. It was never transferred, never annexed, and never placed under the authority of the neighborhood association. The land they were calling a shared walkway was legally the same piece of ground where my family had planted trees, built memories, and paid taxes for over 6 decades. I remember staring at those documents for a long time, not because I was surprised, but because I was trying to understand how someone could make such a serious decision without checking the basics. When you deal with property, especially property that affects dozens of homeowners, you do not just draw a new line because it makes your plans easier. You verify. You investigate. You respect the records. But that was not what happened. I started digging deeper, and that was when I discovered the part that bothered me the most. In 2019, the year before Melissa became president, the neighborhood board had quietly updated their internal community map. They moved the boundary line on their documents by nearly 16 feet, exactly enough to include my side yard in the area they wanted to use. But there was no recorded amendment with the county, no signed agreement from me, no legal transfer. They had changed their own paperwork and acted like changing a drawing changed ownership. I had seen mistakes in surveys before. I had seen people misunderstand old property descriptions. But this was different. This was someone deciding what they wanted reality to be and expecting everyone else to accept it. The next thing I did was not confront Melissa. I wanted to understand her motivation, because I have learned over the years that people rarely make big decisions for only one reason. There is usually something underneath. And in Melissa's case, there was. The community had been arguing for months about access between 2 sections of the neighborhood. Older residents wanted a safer walking route. Parents wanted a shortcut for kids going to the playground. The board wanted a project that would make them look productive. They had already announced plans for a beautiful community path, new lighting and landscaping. They had meetings. They had presentations. They had a vision. The only problem was that their perfect plan depended on land that did not belong to them. Instead of redesigning the project, they convinced themselves the land was already theirs. And once that idea took hold, everything after that became easier for them to justify. I decided it was time to attend the next HOA meeting, not because I wanted a public argument, but because I knew they were telling the neighborhood a version of the story that left out the most important part. The meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday night. I walked in carrying a folder with the documents inside. Melissa was standing near the front, greeting residents and talking confidently about the upcoming walkway project. She looked completely comfortable. She looked like someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. When she saw me holding the folder, she smiled and said, "Daniel, I hope this means you have reconsidered. We are trying to improve the neighborhood, not create conflict." That sentence told me everything. She was framing the situation like I was the obstacle, like I was the person preventing progress. I calmly replied, "Melissa, I am not against improving the neighborhood. I am against improving it with property that does not belong to you." The room got quieter. A few people turned around. Melissa crossed her arms and said, "The boundary issue has already been reviewed by the board." I looked at her and asked, "Reviewed by who?" "Because nobody at the county recorder's office seems to know about your new boundary." That was the first moment I saw her confidence change. It was small, but I noticed it. She stopped smiling. The room was filled with about 70 residents that night, and most of them had only heard one side of the story. They believed the HOA had discovered an overlooked piece of common property. They believed I was simply refusing to cooperate. So I placed the documents on the table in front of everyone. I showed them the original deed. I showed them the 1961 survey. I showed them the county records proving Parcel C had always existed separately. Then I said something I had been waiting weeks to say. This land existed before this neighborhood association. It existed before your rules. It existed before your board. You cannot vote something into existence that you do not own. Nobody said anything for several seconds. It was the kind of silence where everyone is processing the same information at the same time. One homeowner near the back raised his hand and asked Melissa, "Is this true? Did the board change the map without recording it?" Melissa immediately tried to redirect the conversation. She said the documents were old, that things had changed, that the community needed to move forward, but the problem with facts is they do not disappear just because they are inconvenient. By the end of that meeting, people who had walked in thinking I was the problem were asking questions about the board. Someone had recorded the entire discussion, And within hours, clips of the meeting started spreading online. The video showed the moment the documents came out, the moment the room went quiet, and the moment you 5 feet. Melissa realized the conversation was no longer under her control. In less than 2 days, more than 300,000 people had watched the recording. Suddenly, this was no longer a private disagreement between one homeowner and an HOA board. It became a much bigger question about power, property rights, and what happens when an organization starts believing its authority is bigger than the law itself. And that was when the county decided to take a closer look. What they found next would create problems far beyond my backyard, because my side yard was only the beginning of the questions surrounding Willow Creek's decisions. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest weeks of my life because, in a way, I had already won. But it did not feel like winning. When you spend months defending something that has deep personal meaning, the victory is not always a celebration. Sometimes it is just a quiet moment where you realize you can finally stop fighting. The county survey office had confirmed the truth. The original boundary was restored. The survey stakes that had appeared in my yard like a warning were gone. But the bigger issue was that the trust inside the neighborhood had been damaged, and repairing that was going to take much longer than removing a few pieces of orange plastic from the ground. After the county released its findings, homeowners started looking more closely at the way the Willow Creek Board had operated. People who had previously defended Melissa Carter began asking questions. They wanted to know why no one had checked the original records before announcing the project. They wanted to know why the board had presented their own internal map as if it had legal authority. And most importantly, they wanted to know if this was the only time something like this had happened. I watched all of this from a distance because, honestly, I never wanted to become the person who was constantly fighting with neighbors. I did not move into that house to argue. I moved there because of the memories attached to it. I liked the quiet mornings, the sound of the trees moving in the wind, and the feeling that I was taking care of something my grandfather worked hard to build. But sometimes protecting something peaceful requires stepping into conflict. That was the part nobody sees. They see the final moment when someone holds up the document and proves they were right. They do not see the nights spent wondering if you are making things worse, if maybe you should just let it go, if fighting is worth the stress. There were moments when I honestly questioned myself. I remember standing in that side yard one evening, looking at the old apple trees my grandfather planted, and thinking about how easy it would have been to avoid all of this. I could have signed the release. I could have told myself it was only a small piece of land. I could have accepted the idea that giving up a little was easier than fighting a whole organization. But then I remembered something my grandfather used to say. He always told me, a person who does not know what they own will eventually lose it to someone who does. At the time, I thought he was talking about money. I realized later he was talking about responsibility. A few days after the county decision, Melissa Carter came to my house. Not with a clipboard, not with a letter, not with a group of board members behind her. She came alone. I opened the door, and for a moment neither of us said anything. It was almost strange because for months our entire relationship had been through official notices, emails, and meetings where everyone was trying to prove they were right. Standing there face to face, she seemed different. She looked less like a powerful HOA president and more like someone who had finally understood the consequences of a decision. She said, "Daniel, I know you probably do not believe me, but I never thought it would become this big." I told her, that is usually how these things start. Someone thinks a small decision does not matter until they realize it affected someone else's rights. She admitted the board had rushed the project. They were focused on deadlines, appearances, and getting approval from residents. They wanted to show progress. They wanted a big community improvement project that everyone would remember. But somewhere along the way, they stopped asking the most important question. Do we actually have permission to do this? And that question changed everything. I told Melissa that I was willing to move forward, but moving forward did not mean pretending nothing happened. If they wanted this situation resolved, they had to correct the record completely. My first demand was simple. Remove every document, announcement, and statement claiming my property belonged to the HOA. Second, file official county documentation confirming the true boundary so no future board could repeat the same mistake. Third, publicly apologize to the residents who had been given incomplete information. Fourth, reimburse the costs I had spent defending my own property, including the $13,000 professional survey. Fifth, return every fee and violation charge they had issued during the dispute. And finally, the board members responsible for pushing a false claim had to step away from leadership. Melissa looked over the list and asked, "Do you really need all of this?" I looked at her and said, "I need enough protection that nobody has to go through this again." That was the difference. I was not trying to embarrass anyone. I was not trying to destroy the neighborhood. I was trying to make sure the lessons survived after the people involved were gone. Within 36 hours, the agreement was signed. The HOA corrected the records, issued the apology, and covered the costs. The board members involved resigned shortly afterward. The same organization that had tried to redefine my property boundaries was now officially acknowledging that they never had the authority to do so. When the final county documents were recorded, my side yard received a special designation connected to the original family parcel. It was not because the land was valuable. It was not because it was large. It was because history mattered. The trees were still there. The fence was still there. The little path my grandfather walked decades ago was still there. The only thing that changed was that everyone finally understood what it represented. Looking back, I do not think this story was really about a 16-foot piece of land. That was just the thing that started everything. The real story was about what happens when people confuse leadership with ownership. An HOA can create rules. A board can organize improvements. A community can work together to make a neighborhood better. But none of those things give anyone the right to simply take what belongs to someone else. Property lines exist for a reason. Records exist for a reason. History exists for a reason. And sometimes the person who protects that history is not the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it is just the person willing to open an old file cabinet and look for the truth. Today, whenever I walk through that side yard, I think about my grandfather. I think about how he saved those documents without knowing they would one day protect his family decades later. He was not trying to win a battle. He was simply making sure the truth was preserved. And maybe that is the biggest lesson I learned from everything that happened. You do not protect what you love by assuming it will always be there. You protect it by understanding it, documenting it, and standing up when someone tries to rewrite the story. Now I want to hear what you think. If your HOA or neighborhood association tried to claim a piece of land that had been in your family for generations, would you sit down and negotiate like I did? Or would you immediately take the fight to court? Do you think Melissa made a mistake that went too far? Or do you believe the HOA was trying to serve the community and simply handled it the wrong way? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Because at the end of the day, stories like this are not just about property. They are about trust, fairness, and the moment when someone has to decide whether keeping the peace is more important than protecting what is rightfully theirs.